Critical talks aimed at ending the war in Ukraine are happening now in Saudi Arabia, just hours after Kyiv and Moscow traded military fire. That included Ukraine's largest ever air attack on Russia, 337 drones that killed 3 people and injured 18 more. Video shows the moment one of those drones ricocheted down, colliding with this apartment complex in Moscow. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials say Russia launched a ballistic missile and 126 drones overnight, sparking this fire at a fuel depot in Odessa, injuring at least 2 people. It all comes as Secretary of State Marco Rubio tries to secure concessions from Ukrainian leadership, less than 2 weeks after President Zelensky's contentious Oval Office visit. NBC's Keir Simmons is live from Saudi Arabia. I'm also joined by MSNBC international affairs analyst and former ambassador Michael McFaul. Welcome, guys. Keir, give us the latest that we know on these peace talks in Saudi Arabia.
Well, there's a good deal of movement here, but it does appear that the talks are continuing. We're getting towards 9 in the evening, so perhaps we will interpret that as positive. Certainly, the National Security Advisor said getting there earlier today when he was asked how this was going. The spokeswoman for the State Department saying crossed fingers. There have been positive messages. We know the Ukrainians were going in with a proposal for a partial ceasefire on air and on the sea. So are they talking more closely about that? It looks as if that might be taken to the Russians. We are hearing that Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy, will head to Moscow to meet for the second time with President Putin. There's a lot on the agenda, so perhaps it's not surprising that they have been in talks for hours now. When they finish, I'm not sure you're going to see a kind of kumbaya, kind of joint press conference. I think you'll see separate statements, and I don't think you'll necessarily see a kind of signing of a minerals deal or something like that. After that disaster in the Oval Office, it's going to take time to try to repair things. I think both sides recognise that, but it does look tonight as if here in Saudi Arabia they are making diplomatic progress, inching things forward. The question, of course, too, though, is about how the Russians will behave. You talked about that massive drone strike. There has been escalating attacks by the Russians in Ukraine in recent days. They are trying to push the Ukrainians out of the Kursk region. The Ukrainians still holding tightly onto a small piece of territory, of Russian territory there. And one of the questions you have to ask is why the Russians would agree to a ceasefire now if they think they are making progress there, for example. And that's not even talking about what they do when they try and get to a deal. I mean, even though these talks are taking place, both sides continue to attack each other. Ukraine and Russia don't talk to each other except for the language of war.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Keir Simmons. As things might develop there, please give us the high sign and we'll get back to you. So Ambassador Marco Rubio actually did kind of lay out his sense of the goals on the plane to Saudi Arabia. So let me play that.
You're not going to get a ceasefire and an end of this war unless both sides make concessions. That's just obvious. We'll need to see, maybe we won't go into great details. We're not going to be sitting in a room drawing lines on a map, but just get a general sense of what concessions are in the realm of the possible for them and what they would need in return, and then find out what the Russian position is in that regard.
So what do you think realistic concessions might look like on Ukraine's end?
Well, first, before we get there, I just want to underscore, we've never, ever heard anything about what the Russians are supposed to concede. And I've listened very closely. We just listened. Thanks for playing that tape again. But always, it's about what the Ukrainians are supposed to do. And their frustration, I can tell you, is that we never talk about the other side. On the Ukrainian side, however, to answer your question, I think they've been pretty clear that tragically, but necessarily, they are willing to seek unification through peaceful means. That's the language that President Zelensky has used in return for some kind of security guarantee from the West. In other words, that means they're not going to try to reunify to the 1991 borders now. They're going to allow Russia to occupy parts of their country, but in return, they want it to be a lasting peace, a lasting ceasefire, because remember, President Zelensky already sat with Vladimir Putin in 2019. Europeans were at the table. We weren't at the table. He already signed a ceasefire agreement. And 3 years later, Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So does not want to repeat that mistake from 2019.
Well, a warning flag was sent up, Mr. Ambassador, from Democratic Senator Mark Kelly, who, as you know, has visited Ukraine multiple times. Here's what he said.
I want this conflict to end, but it needs to end in a way where Putin walks away from this thinking that, well, maybe he's never going to say it publicly, understanding that this was a bad deal and a bad idea for him. If he thinks he benefited from this in any way, that's where we run the risk of seeing a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, more conflict in Europe.
What do you think needs to happen for Putin to get that message?
Well, the best thing would be to put invite Ukraine to join NATO. I know the president took that off the table, but that was a mistake. The Soviet Union never attacked a NATO country. Russia has never attacked a NATO country. And by the way, NATO has never attacked the Soviet Union or Russia. If you're serious about an enduring peace, that's the obvious decision that could be made. Second, if the president is against that, then you need peacekeepers inside Ukraine to raise the stakes of a potential war in the future, just as the senator was just describing. And third, I think you need to take the Russian money that's sitting, 300 billion or so, that's sitting mostly in European bank accounts, but also in American bank accounts, and give that money for Ukrainian reconstruction. That would send a signal that if you invade again, there will be consequences. And I would add to that, if I were negotiating, I would increase our military sales to Ukraine. Arm them to the teeth so that the next time Putin thinks about invading, he won't be facing a disarmed Ukraine as he was 3 years ago, but one with full capacity Air Force, air defenses that will make that invasion calculation much more costly.